Kinzer, on behalf of the Middle East Discussion Group at the Josef Korbel School, I would like to welcome you to a Middle East Discussion Group conversation.
Great to be here with you.
Great to have you. Your new book, The Brothers, focuses on John Foster and Allen Dulles, the post-World War II kind of environment. And you go from all over the world, Iran, Vietnam, Indonesia. But today I'm going to try to focus you in on the Middle East, appropriately enough. And let's begin with the Iranian overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. First of all, how did Allen Dulles become who he was? How did he become the chief spy master of the United States? And what drew his attention to Iran to begin with? Why was that the first place he looked?
Well, Allen Dulles had a fascination with espionage ever since he was a little kid. Even later in life, he wrote about how going fishing was something that he thought taught him about how to be a spy, because you had to outsmart the fish and get him to the point where he was actually happy to be caught. This was what he was thinking when he was 10 years old. So later on, he became an intelligence officer in Switzerland during the First World War under the guise of being a diplomat, because we didn't have an intelligence service. In the Second World War, when we did have an intelligence service, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, Allen Dulles was the chief of the OSS station in Switzerland, which was a neutral country, so very important for the rest of Europe, and was running espionage and covert operations all over Europe. And at the end of the war, since there was no need for an OSS station in Switzerland anymore, he became head of the OSS station in Berlin. He moved to Germany. But he'd only been there a couple of weeks when President Harry Truman announced that he was abolishing the OSS. Truman didn't want to have a spy service or covert operations service. So suddenly, Allen Dulles didn't have a job. He went back to his former job at Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm on Wall Street where his older brother, John Foster Dulles, was the managing partner. And he went back to the business that Sullivan and Cromwell's famous for, which is pushing around small countries in order to promote the interests of American corporations who hired that firm and the Dulles brothers to do their work. In 1947, Allen Dulles co-authored the National Security Act that, among other things, created the CIA. And in this act, there's something very important that was revolutionary, completely new in the history of Western secret services. It had always been a rule in all these secret services that you have to have an absolute division, an impenetrable firewall between the people, on the one hand, who gather and analyze intelligence, and then on the other hand, the people who carry out covert operations. Other services, like the British, who were thought of as having the gold standard of intelligence, always insisted that if you had these together in one organization, there would be inevitable pressure on the intelligence analysts to analyze everything in a way that would lead to the conclusion, and so we need to have a covert operation. So the CIA became the first Western service that combined both of them. And sure enough, exactly what the British had feared came to pass. Every piece of intelligence analysis led to the conclusion, we need a covert operation. So with that institutional framework, Allen Dulles then rose in 1953 to become head of the CIA. Now, you asked me how he got interested in Iran. I think it goes back to his time at Sullivan and Cromwell. He had two reasons, I think, to be upset with Mohammad Mossadegh and the democratic government of Iran. Now, one of those reasons is fairly well known, and that is that Iran, of course, nationalized its oil industry under the Mossadegh leadership, and the financial agent for the oil company that owned the Iranian oil industry was a bank called the Schroeder Bank, a big international bank, And that was a client of Sullivan and Cromwell. And in fact, Allen Dulles was on the board of the Schroeder Bank. So he essentially had to go to his friends at the Schroeder Bank and say, we failed you. You hired us to protect your interests in Iran, but because of this madman, Mossadegh, we lost. You lost your interests. He didn't like that. That's one that's somewhat well known. But in my book, I came up with a new one that I don't think has ever been discussed or talked about in public. This connection I don't think has ever been made. Allen Dulles never really liked being a corporate lawyer the way that his older brother did. He had global ambitions, and he always had this interest in trying to manipulate the world. And finally, in the late 1940s, in 1949, he found a client that had global ambitions that matched his own. And that was this remarkable group of engineering firms. It was all, I think, the 11 major engineering firms in the United States got together to form this organization called Overseas Consultants, Inc. So OCI, it was called. And OCI had this huge ambition that they were going to get mega projects in the world and transform nations. And they focused on Iran. Iran needed transformation. It was a very poor country. It also had cash because it was getting royalties from oil and access to loans from the United States. So they had money to pay and they had great need. So OCI went over to Iran and created a huge plan. It's 5 volumes long. It's probably the most exhaustive cataloging of Iran that's ever been made. What diseases are found in which village, in which province, and how many houses are needed to support how many sheep herders in another place in Iran. It's an amazing detail. And the partner that OCI found was the Shah. This was, of course, in the late 40s when the Shah was still relatively weak, and he didn't feel comfortable signing a contract for what was going to be the biggest international development project in history. It was, in modern terms, would have been well into the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars worth. So OCI needed to find a way to get the Shah to sign this contract. They needed an intermediary. So they hired Sullivan and Cromwell, and Allen Dulles got the job. Of course, he had been head of the Near East Bureau of the State Department, and he knew that part of the world very well. He went to Iran. He met with the Shah. Within a week after he came back, the announcement was made, the Shah has signed the OCI contract. This was the biggest triumph in the legal career of Allen Dulles, and a huge moment, both for Sullivan and Cromwell and for OCI. It was also important for America, because once you have a huge project like this in Iran, you're able to have people all over the country, you see everything, you can control everything, so it seemed good for everybody. And Allen Dulles then brought the Shah to the United States to speak to the Council on Foreign Relations. And that night, I think he sealed for this foreign policy establishment the idea that America's partner in Iran is this guy, the Shah. Everything was perfect. It looked beautiful. But then what happened? Mossadegh and his people in the National Front began to protest against this project. They didn't want a mega American project in Iran. They wanted Iranians to do this kind of work. They didn't like the idea of this giant ambitious project thought of all by foreigners. So slowly they organized resistance, and in the end, the program had collapsed. It died. The Iranian parliament would not accept it. Allen Dulles received a huge slap in the face. This was his biggest legal project in his life. And thanks to Mossadegh, it was killed. So take that, and the fact that Mossadegh had nationalized oil in a way that affected another company with which Allen Dulles was deeply involved. And I think you can understand why Allen Dulles, along with his older brother, John Foster Dulles, carried with him into high office a deep grudge against Mossadegh. And I think that's a large part of the root of the 1953 coup that not only deposed Mossadegh, but ended democracy in Iran.
When you see Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles playing the chessboard in your game, or in your book, I'm struck by the fact that while they are, in their own way or in their own mind, advocating for American interests, what they are really advocating for are corporate interests. I mean, that's what these guys fought for. They were Wall Street guys.
You're absolutely right, and I would say if you ask them this question, they would say, but aren't those the same? They really believe that the interests of big American corporations and the interests of the United States were the same thing. And I think you can see that because how do they justify to themselves going to a country like Iran, which had a relatively well-rooted democracy, and then carrying out an operation which left a dictatorship? Within a few months, they did the same thing in Guatemala. They destroyed a democratic government and left a dictatorship. Now, if you're a promoter of freedom and democracy, and you go to church on Sunday and thank God that you're not like other men, how do you justify doing something like this? I think one of the key ways that they justified it was their definition of freedom. Freedom means the ability of foreign companies to invest where they want. A country is free if it allows foreign corporations to work freely and invest freely and extract resources freely. If a country or a government imposes limits or restrictions on how much power and authority and freedom foreign corporations can have, that country is not free. And by that standard, they took an unfree Iran, unfree in the sense that it did not give the Anglo-Iranian oil company freedom to act, and when they left and the Shah was in power, Iran was then free because it was open for foreign investment.
Now, a character who doesn't get quite as much attention in this book, but who comes up because it's inevitable when you're talking about this region, is Gamal Abdel Nasser. And what's unique about Nasser is that Foster Dulles, as well as Allen Dulles, they had big plans for him, but it never came to fruition the way it did in Iran. The mishandling of the Aswan Dam loan. What made the Nasser situation in Egypt different than the Mossadegh situation in Iran?
Well, there's no doubt that they felt the same enmity toward Nasser that they felt toward Mossadegh. In a sense, those two characters, Mossadegh and Nasser, represented the great force that was emerging in the 1950s in the world, which was third world nationalism. Now, Nasser, of course, was the paragon of Arab nationalism. And the Dulles brothers felt, we can bring Nasser into an alliance with the United States. This was a complete misunderstanding of Arab nationalism, which has as its fundamental principle no alliances with outside powers. So this was a fantasy from the beginning. But when it became clear to them that Nasser was not going to cooperate, they got angry. And we even have a report from one of Allen Dulles' agents in Egypt. Allen Dulles came over there to work on a plot to try to undermine Nasser, and he told his station chief in Cairo, if that colonel of yours, referring to Nasser, if that colonel of yours pushes us too far, we'll break him in half. This is the way that an American official is speaking about the head of state of another country. So, the idea was that they could undermine Nasser and perhaps bring him down. And they started working on this project. But a couple of things happened. First of all, the Suez operation, the invasion of Egypt by the British, the French, and the Israelis, turned Nasser into a superhero in Egypt and in the wider Arab world. And that led the Dulles brothers to realize this isn't going to work. But there was something else, and that had to do with the Aswan Dam. And I think this is another example of the short-sightedness of the Dulles brothers. The way that the United States felt that we could show Nasser and Egypt that we were Egypt's friend was to support this mega project, the Aswan Dam, which was going to provide fertile land for millions of Egyptians who didn't have food and didn't have land. And we offered to give a loan to Egypt to support that project. But when we found out that Nasser was not willing to do everything we wanted, Foster Dulles personally told the Egyptian ambassador in Washington, we're canceling the loan. Nasser was furious. In fact, in one of his speeches, he said, "America, may you choke on your fury." And then he turned to the Soviet Union. He said to the Soviets, America's not helping me build the S-1 dam. Will you do it? And the Soviets saw their chance. They said yes. Not only did they help build the S-1 dam, but they started sending military aid to Egypt. And not just a few pistols. These were huge fleets of MiG fighters and tanks. Soviet power came into the Middle East for the first time. And that was something the Dulles brothers had sworn to prevent. And how did it get there? Why did the Soviet Union find a foothold in the Middle East for the first time? Not because they invaded a country, not because they undermined or penetrated a weak political system, but at the open invitation of the legitimate and hugely powerful leader of an important country. And why did he do that? Because the Dulles brothers had spit in his face. So they, the Dulles brothers, were responsible for creating the result that they thought they were sworn to prevent. And that shows you how much they misunderstood that part of the world.
It's very difficult to read your book and not see parallels to today. Eisenhower had a preference for covert operations. This is why Allen Dulles was able to have the freedom that he did to operate the way he did. And I think Obama sort of shares that if I can do this in a small way, the light footprint idea, that this is somehow preferable. But your book is it's a warning that there comes with these covert operations, with these sort of dirty tricks, eventual blowback. And do you see those parallels yourself when you look at the way the Obama administration is conducting foreign policy right now?
I think there are some parallels. The Dulles brothers and Dwight Eisenhower loved covert action in part because it seemed so low cost, not just in dollars, but also in blood. Eisenhower had to send soldiers out to die by the thousands. Here he was able to overthrow governments and just a few dozen people would die, and none of them were Americans. So it seemed great. You see a little of that today, I think. With the idea, we're not going to put huge amounts of soldiers, we're not going to have what they call boots on the ground, we're just going to have these light footprint operations, we're going to have drone strikes and special forces attacks. And it's true, those are a lot less costly for us, a lot less controversial in the United States. But what I think we don't understand is that in the target countries, they're still seen the same way. They are seen as attacks on us. So they seem like a very different kind of policy from our perspective, from the perspective of the force that is committing these acts. But for the target countries, they still seem like what they are, which is an attack. And therefore, the blowback in the future will be just as great, or nearly as great, as it would have been with a full-scale attack. They're both aimed at the same thing, which is projecting American power in a violent way to undermine processes going on in other countries. Now, you can argue whether some of those operations are justified or not. That's another question. But in the minds of the people who live in the target countries, those things still seem like attacks. And while they seem very different from attacks to us, other people see them differently.
Well, Baba Blues, I would like to thank you very much for joining us today. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.